In this video, I'm going to be introducing shading in Blender. I'm going to be doing so through a PBR pipeline, which stands for Physically Based Rendering, which uses a series of image textures, layering them together to create photorealistic materials. I feel like this is a great starting point to understanding shading because it's based off of reality and how we're already used to perceiving and seeing materials and objects and textures before we start getting too abstract with our shaders. Now, how you've might have already played around with materials is accessing it through our properties panel here on our right. If you hover over these icons, they'll tell you what they do. This one says material, and Blender already starts you off with their principal BSDF, which stands for bidirectional scattering distribution function. You don't have to memorize that, but it's a great shader because it has a lot of information and a lot of tools you can use in creating your materials and shaders. We're probably only going to use about 4 of them, but as you kind of develop your understanding of materials and shading, you can experiment and expand and make more complex ones. Now, this first one is our base color, and if you drag it, you can change the color of it, and if that's not showing up, you need to change your viewport display. If you go up here and hover over these icons that look like little globes, the viewport shading goes from solid to different material displays. Now, since we're dealing with shading, we should probably switch our workspace. If you up here at the top, since we're on layout, if we go all the way over to shading, this gives us a lot more information and control over our shaders. And the layout of the workspace is designed accordingly. Up here at the top is our render preview. And again, we can always change how that looks. Over here on our left, we can have our different images for our texture. But over here in our shader editor, it already gives us our what's considered these nodes. And the first one, the main one, resembles our principal BSDF shader. Now, what's great about this is we can add more nodes, which are these little boxes, to create more complex shaders. So if I drag, it'll kind of come up with all these different options. You can also add them over here in this screen. And you notice they all add up to our surface material output. But since we're going to be using image textures, we need to go find some images. And the best place to do this is online. There's several websites you can use. I think a great one is Ambient CG. And if you click on materials, they give you a wide range of different ones. Now I'm going to start off with just this basic brick texture. If you notice here, it gives you several options. You can get, depends on how high depth you want to do it. If you want something that's transparent, you're going to want a PNG. If it doesn't, since I don't, you can go with a JPEG. It's usually going to be a little bit lower file size, which is great. And I typically will do around 2K, kind of keep that file size pretty small. So go ahead and download it and extract that folder to a spot that you're going to remember and keep it organized. So back over here, if we open up that folder, there's a lot of different image textures in here. And again, we're going to probably just focus on 3 or 4 in the beginning. So our first one is our color. And if we drag that into our shader editor in Blender, it creates an image texture for us. We can also add it if we go to add texture. Image texture is another way we can do that and create that node, but we don't need to. It makes it a little bit quicker if you just drag it. And you notice it has this color node on here, and I can drag that over into my principal BSDF shader, and it adds that image texture to my object. Now let's take a look at some of these other categories. So if we open up, again, our folder is always a good starting point. And really the top 3 that I typically work with are color, roughness, and my normal map. So let's add our roughness next. So let's drag that object over here. And the roughness creates variance in our roughness. Rather than just using this slider over here that we can use to make something shiny or glossy, things aren't universally the same roughness. So it gives us a little bit more information over that. So I'm going to drag this color. And you notice this is in color, but the image is not. And it lets us know that too by looking at these nodes over here are in just gray. So I got to make sure that my color space on this node is marked for non-color. So now I'm going to drag that over to my roughness. And it's kind of hard to see, but it's adding a little bit more variation and detail into my shader. So let's add a normal map. Now, normal map is going to actually add some depth to our object. And normal maps, you're going to know some because they have this weird purpley blue. And we want to go with the normal GL. That's what Blender typically uses. The normal DX is DirectX, which is designed typically for Windows. So we're going to drag in the normal GL and drop that normal map in there. And one thing we want to notice too is over here, our normal node is in purple and our color node is in yellow. So we want to add a converter. So it knows that we're dealing with a normal map. And we're going to do that by going to add vector normal map. So let's know that it's a normal map. We'll drag the normal, the color to the color, and the normal to the normal. And it's kind of hard to see, but let me drag it away. And you can see that it adds a little bit of a bump in there and adds some depth. And for the most part, this is typically all that I use because normal maps are great because it just does just enough of a texture increase to give some depth. But if it's not enough and you want to actually bump this out more, you want to add a displacement map. So if we go open up our folder again, there's this black and white image called a displacement. So I'm going to drag that into our scene. And then before I do that, I want to make sure a couple options are selected. First, I want to make sure that displacement maps are activated in my material. So over here, my properties, I'm going to zoom all the way down to settings. I'll minimize some of the other ones. Over here under settings, and right now it says displacement. It'll start off with just bump only. You want to make sure that displacement and bump is selected. Another thing is I want to change my renderer. So on my properties, this little camera icon that says render, and it typically starts out in EV, but I'm going to switch over to cycles. And then cycles gives us a little bit more information, but also slows down your computer. So you want to make sure your device, if you have the option, is switching over to GPU and using your graphics processor. So now that those are selected, let's take a look at where we're going to plug in our displacement map. So if I zoom out, it's actually over here in my material output. And again, this one's in purple. So I need to add a converter. So I want to go to add vector displacement. So now I'm going to drag my color over to height this time. So I'll zoom in a little bit. You can see that I'm connecting it to the height because again, this is going to actually add texture and depth to my object. And again, it's in black and white. So make sure non-color is your selected color space. And let's go ahead and drag this over to our material. So I'll drag it over here and I'll zoom in again so you can kind of see where I'm dragging that into. And make sure it's in my, now I have my displacement node to my displacement. And it hasn't, we can't see what it's doing because we need to change our render setting. And now you can see that it's actually adding quite a bit of depth to our object. And we can drag it and drop it to change it. And then I will plop it back in so you can see. Oh, it's on the volume. But you notice it's kind of tweaking out my object and my mesh. And that's because I need to increase my detail in my mesh because the displacement map is actually modifying the mesh. So I will go to and add a modifier, and I will create a subdivision surface to add a little bit more detail in my mesh. And you notice how it deforms quite a bit. And I can turn down some of these numbers on my displacement. The first one I'll usually drop is my mid-level down to 0. And let's make the scale closer to 0.1. And that's looking a little bit better. And you can, if you want, you can increase your subdivisions, which is good. But again, like adding this displacements, modifying the mesh, adding more detail to the mesh, which means a larger file size. Again, this detail looks great, but it's also going to increase your render times and just the size of your project. So if you can, and if it doesn't need it, stick with a normal map. But if you want this more detail in modifying the mesh, use a displacement map. So the last thing I'm going to look at is changing the size of my image texture on my object. And there's different ways you could do that. I feel the best way to do that is through here, my shader editor, though, to keep everything organized. Now, there is a add-on that helps out with this known as Node Wrangler, but I'm going to try to get by without add-ons in the beginning. So I'll go to Add, and I'm going to first add a map. So I go under Vector, and I go to Mapping. And then the next, I'm going to add a texture coordinate. Another way you can add one of these nodes is if you go to Shift A, you can add, you can search for texture coordinate and it'll pop up. Again, you can also add it, go to add, input, texture coordinate, but just a quicker way of doing that. Now we'll go into UVs a little bit later, but for now, that's what you're going to connect to your vector in our mapping. So right now I have UV connected to vector. And then I'm going to connect all these vector nodes to my mapping. So they're all on the same mapping system. So there's my color. Let's connect it to my roughness. And I will drop it into my normal map as well as my displacement. I'll zoom back in so it's easier to see. So looking at our map, that's all connected to all the vectors on my image. So they're all related. If I change, I can change these numbers here from location to rotation to scale to actually modify how it fits on my object. So if I increase the scale, it will make the bricks a lot smaller. So that's kind of just the general introduction, again, to PBR texturing. There's a lot more that you can do with it, but for just out in the beginning, I feel like this is a great starting point. So I would only use the displacement map if you absolutely need this extra depth. More often than not, this could probably be achieved by just modeling it on your own. And you could just focus on these top three, which is your base color, your roughness, and your normal matte.